Welcome to my review of Adventure Island 2 for the Game Boy. And this is actually a real good game on the system, much better than the first game on the NES. It took me around 4 hours and 28 minutes to beat, and the game has unlimited continues and passwords. Though it's better to continue than use the password will make you start at the beginning of the last world you got to, while continuing will just set you back to the last stage you got to. And if you continue, you get to keep all your items. If you use the password, you lose all your items. So if you're actually using a real Game Boy, then I guess a password is a good option since the battery life isn't too long. Or you may have to shut it off at some point. But I was playing on an emulator, which is a lot more convenient. And I will post up the link to my tutorial in the description. That has commentary, breaks down all the strategies I used, and everything like that. It has an overworld map similar to Super Mario Bros. 3. And you can go back to any stages you beat, replay them to get items. And, you can collect a shitload of items if you want, and you can bring them to other stages. Which I do recommend farming Stage 1-1 to get a bunch of axes, basically, and rideable dragons that you can use later. Otherwise, you will have to play some of the stages without weapons, which can be pretty shitty. And it can make it a lot harder. Similar to the first game, which intentionally makes you play stages and beat them without any weapons. The first game on the NES, which I'm at the end of, but I got to finish that playthrough. But that one is much, much harder. This is actually a very easy game for this type of game, especially from the time period. With a few challenging parts, the final boss can be pretty cheap, which I'm going to show the full final boss fight in the review. But for the most part, the game is quite easy for these kind of games, but it's an enjoyable game. One of the downsides is that some of the bosses, they can take quite a few hits, and some of them are kind of tedious and irritating, but they're decent boss fights for the most part. Aside from the final boss, I thought the first form of the final boss was kind of cheap, kind of shitty, but very learnable. It just it was definitely not the clearest thing when trying to figure it out myself without studying some videos and using a lot of save state practice. So I can imagine that playing it on the original Game Boy and having to beat the stage each time just to practice the boss for about 2 seconds would be irritating. So of course, if you're playing without save state practice, your time could be a lot longer. And also depending on your skill level. But so this is the first boss, and I'll show a few samples of the bosses. First boss is very, very simple. The boss's bodies usually can't hurt you, so it's mostly about dodging any projectiles that the boss may fire. That's usually the issue. But the first boss is very easy. I seem to think that the hammer is like the best regular weapon because the boomerang is slow. I don't know if the damage is worth it, but the fire rate of the hammer is fucking great. And you can really get a lot of hits in, as you'll see later. But I was early to the game, and this is just happened to be the weapon that I had when I got here. So maybe it would have been a faster fight without that. But you get the idea. I'm not showing any of the boss fights in their entirety except for the final bosses. So sometimes when you don't have a weapon, this is what happens. You'll have to jump and make your way through the stages without any weapons. And, you really have to set up your jumps properly and time everything right. And it can be tough because the hit detection, you have a huge hitbox on your character. And, in a lot of games, you can get pretty close to the enemies. In this game, it always seems to work against me if I get too close. I don't seem to have that extra leniency that I would expect in a game, so I'll get killed. It's one-hit deaths. Unless you have a rideable dragon, you can take an extra hit, or if you have a shield power-up, which I may have only gotten once in the game, you can take an extra hit. But most of the time, you die in one hit. But there are no checkpoints in the stages or on the bosses, but you will be able to start at the beginning of the stage as long as you choose to continue instead of going back out to the password screen. But see, you see me playing here without any weapons. But this is easily fixed. If you want, you can go back to a stage like Stage 1-1 and just grab some axes. And you can stock up like as many as you want. I stocked up like 30 of them. It did take a little while. But I have like 30 of them, like maybe 10 or 15 rideable dragons, just that I got from Stage 1-1 that I stocked up by replaying the stage again and again. So you do have that option. And I do recommend doing that a little bit before you progress through the game. That way you'll just have some weapons stocked up and you won't have to try to play through stages with no weapons, because I do feel like the game kind of suffers with that hit detection with the large hitbox. And of course it's zoomed in. Because it's a Game Boy game, they have to zoom it in, and you can't see as far ahead of you as something like on the NES, for example. Normally NES games give you a little bit more room. The well-made ones, obviously, not the shitty games. So there is that. And those are a few strikes against it, obviously. And the fact that the boss fights, some of them can be a little tedious and not the best boss fights. But for the most part, they're pretty decent. I mean, boss fights weren't the highlight of a lot of games from this period. You have your water levels as well, and there is a water dragon that allows you to traverse water quicker, though it's really unnecessary. Because as long as you just bring some axes into the water stages, you can kind of just slowly swim through the stage and keep throwing axes. And for the most part, you have to do like a little bit of maneuvering here and there, but none of them are too difficult. I mean, and that's pretty much the basics of the game, but I will show some more gameplay just to give you an idea. I'm going to show the final boss in full. And I'll try to describe some of the bullshit. Of course, you're going to see my well-executed run. This is from my actual completed run of the game, the edited version of that run. So there's not going to be any deaths in the review. So you're going to see a clean attempt on the final boss, but I'll try to describe it. It's a little bullshitty. I try to detail it more in the tutorial, but it is kind of hard to explain the strategy that I used. It was definitely not a clear strat. That's kind of why I thought the final boss was kind of cheap and a little shitty, because it's not really too logical as far as, for me it wasn't. It's kind of obscure. So you can also get this pterodactyl, which is pretty shitty for attacking bosses, but it's okay for attacking the enemies. Main thing is it can skip levels and shit like that because it can fly all the way up. And some levels don't have a ceiling, so you can really skip through. So it's good for pulling bullshit for skipping some stages, but it's not good for boss fights. But it does let you take an extra. This crab is one of the hardest bosses in the game, aside from the first form of the final boss. The main reason it's hard is because it's kind of easy to fuck up, and it takes a lot of hits. So it makes it kind of an irritating fight. But really, you don't want that bird for this fight anyway. It's a pretty simple pattern of 2 rotations, then it throws out its claw. And, you jump over it, you get down here, get some hits in, jump over it, and repeat. And about halfway through, it changes into a different color, which means that it's going to change the pattern up a little bit. But it definitely goes on for a while. What makes it a little tricky is, of course, you can only get hit once. So if you fuck it up a little bit, then then you got to replay the stage again. But it's really not too hard execution-wise. It's just a little bit irritating with the hitboxes. So see, now he changes his pattern. He's going to throw out like usual, but he's going to do an extra strike where you want to kind of jump away. He tries to hit you from the back while he's still up there. But the rest of the pattern is exactly the same. It just goes on, because you can see how long it was. You see how long the first half was. The second half is probably about the same length. So it's kind of a long fight, and it is easy to fuck up. So this is the final boss. Very cheap. The saucer itself can't hurt you, but the lasers will completely bury you. Like, there's not really enough room to get past the lasers if you're under them. It is possible to dodge them, but very, very hard. So pretty much you gotta not be in range of his lasers and jump over the saucer. And there is a trick in the beginning that I explained in the tutorial where initially you have to let him cross the gap in the middle. And you gotta stop firing completely, otherwise you'll trigger a teleport. And you don't want him really to do that early in the fight, because you want to try to get as many hits in as you can in the beginning. At least that's what I try to do. You don't have to do it that way, but I try to shorten the fight. But it is hard when he starts teleporting. Very easy to fuck up when he starts teleporting. You're not going to see it here, though, because, like I said, this was a no damage run of the 2 final bosses. I was able to beat it without any damage on this when I beat the game. The second form is very easy. So that's not a problem once you know what to do. But the first form can be a pain in the ass. It took quite a bit of practice. It doesn't look like anything difficult, but it was very specific. But overall, this game was quite good. Definitely one of the better action games I played on the Game Boy. And I think it stands up well to other action games on the system. I wouldn't put it at the top. But for me, it's a 7.5 out of 10, which means I think it's in that good range, like that mid good range. You know, not quite what I consider a great game. The NES ones might be. I have to play Adventure Island 2 and 3 on the NES, and maybe 4. But those actually might be, you know, great games. I don't know. But this one is quite good. Definitely worth playing if you're into these type of action games. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.